If you looked at me tonight, you'd see a woman adored by the crowd. The shimmering chandeliers overhead cast their golden glow on my gown, photographers jostled for the perfect shot, and donors leaned forward, hanging on every word I spoke at the podium. To them, I was Olivia Carter, the elegant queen of Detroit's charity circuit, the woman who'd helped raise millions for children's hospitals and community programs. What they couldn't see was the war beneath the smile. What they'd never guess was that the man standing just a few feet away, shaking hands and laughing easily, had once tried to destroy me. And what he didn't know. Tonight wasn't just another gala. Tonight was the night he'd finally pay for everything. 10 years earlier, the night had looked almost the same. I was 36 then, still glowing with the naive belief that hard work and good intentions were enough to change the world. The Carter Foundation was our empire. My late father had been a respected philanthropist, and when he passed, Andrew and I inherited not just his wealth but his legacy. At least, that's what I thought. By day, I was the face of the foundation, the warm, approachable figure people trusted. I spoke at luncheons, toured children's wards, smiled for cameras at ribbon cuttings. Donors believed in me, and that belief filled our coffers year after year. Andrew, though, preferred the shadows. He handled the business side, meeting with hedge funds and corporate sponsors behind closed doors. The arrangement worked, or so I believed, because I trusted him completely. Until one evening, while searching for a misplaced grant proposal on Andrew's laptop, I found a folder buried deep in his emails. At first glance, it looked like random spreadsheets and foreign wire transfers. But as I clicked through, my pulse quickened. The numbers didn't match our reported donations. Funds meant for community programs were being funneled into shell corporations in the Cayman Islands and Zurich. There were even encrypted memos between Andrew and a man named Hallstrom discussing diversion percentages and keeping the board quiet. My stomach sank. It wasn't just sloppy accounting. It was fraud, on a massive scale. The man I'd built a life with, whose arm I'd held through every public appearance, had been stealing from the very causes we championed. I waited for him that night in our Bloomfield Hills mansion, pacing across the marble floor as rain lashed against the tall windows. When Andrew finally walked in, loosened tie and the faint smell of bourbon on his breath, I held the printed documents out to him. "Andrew," I said, my voice trembling, "explain this." He barely glanced at the papers. Instead, he gave me a slow, almost amused smile. "Olivia, you really should have stayed out of things you don't understand." My anger boiled. Millions are missing. These charities depend on us. You've been lying to me, to everyone. He cut me off with a sharp laugh. "Lying to you? Oh, sweetheart, you've been so eager to play the perfect charity queen that you didn't even notice what's been happening under your nose." Then, with a casualness that chilled me to the bone, he turned the tables. "Do you know what this looks like? You, the public face of the foundation, conveniently with access to every account. Who's going to believe you weren't the one mishandling the funds?" I froze, the room tilting around me. You wouldn't dare. But he did. The very next morning, Andrew held a press conference at the foundation headquarters. I wasn't invited. I watched on live TV as he stood at a podium flanked by board members and high-profile donors, wearing his most sympathetic expression. "My friends," he said, his voice breaking just enough to sound heartfelt, "it's with great sadness that I share troubling news. Mismanagement of funds has been discovered within our foundation. While the investigation is ongoing, evidence suggests my wife, Olivia, has been involved in questionable practices." Gasps rippled through the crowd. He painted me as the villain, a woman corrupted by access and ambition. By the time he finished, reporters were shouting questions, board members were whispering furiously, and my phone was lighting up with texts from friends asking, "How could you?" In a single, calculated speech, Andrew erased me. By the end of the day, donors were withdrawing support, friends refused to return my calls, and even Sophia, my closest confidant, warned me to keep my head down until the storm passed. Andrew came home that night like nothing had happened, whistling as he poured himself a drink. He didn't even glance at me as he said, You should pack your things. It's over. He didn't just steal my reputation. He buried me alive. But as I sat alone in that cavernous house, the headlines swirling and my so-called friends turning their backs, I realized something Andrew never would. The dirt he shoveled over me wasn't a grave. It was the foundation of the empire I was going to build, and the perfect cover for the grave I'd dig for him. The fall didn't happen all at once. It came piece by piece, like watching a house collapse one brick at a time while you're still standing inside it. Within a week of Andrew's press conference, I was forced to leave the mansion. The home I'd spent years decorating, the one where my children had taken their first steps and where every wall held memories, was no longer mine. Andrew had changed the locks and posted private security at the gate. When I tried to go back for my things, one of the guards simply shook his head and handed me a cardboard box with a few clothes and toiletries stuffed inside. Reporters were camped at the end of the driveway, their cameras flashing like lightning whenever I appeared. "Olivia, did you steal from sick children?" one shouted. "Did you funnel donations to your personal accounts?" another yelled, his voice sharp and eager for blood. Each question was a dagger. I wanted to scream the truth at them, to shout Andrew's name so loudly the whole world would hear. But I knew how it would look, a disgraced wife, flailing wildly to shift the blame. No one would believe me. By the time I reached the safety of the city, my reputation was already shredded. Donors issued statements cutting ties. Former friends who used to beg for invites to my galas now crossed the street to avoid me. I rented a small apartment in downtown Detroit, a cramped, two-bedroom space above a noisy street, its peeling paint a far cry from the pristine luxury of Bloomfield Hills. That first night, I sat on the edge of a sagging bed and stared at the blank wall across from me. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, another headline alert lighting up the screen. Disgraced philanthropist Olivia Carter hides as foundation faces fallout. I turned it face down and buried my head in my hands. The worst blow hadn't been the headlines or even the eviction. It was my children. Andrew told the court I was unstable and unfit, spinning stories of my supposed fraud and reckless spending. Until things were sorted out, the judge awarded him temporary custody. I wasn't even allowed supervised visits. For weeks, I lived in a fog of grief and humiliation. There were days I didn't leave the apartment, afraid of the cameras lurking outside. Nights where I sat in darkness, clutching a wine glass and wondering how I'd been so blind. One particularly bitter evening, I considered packing a bag and disappearing entirely. Just leaving Detroit, leaving the whispers, leaving everything. That was when Sophia appeared. She didn't knock softly, she pounded on the door like a storm. When I opened it, she stood there in her sharp gray suit, hair perfectly pinned, eyes blazing with something I hadn't seen in weeks, belief. "Get up," she said, brushing past me into the room. I sank onto the couch, mumbling, "Sophia, it's over. Andrew's won. Everyone believes him." Sophia turned on me like a whip. "Everyone believes him now," she snapped. "But you know better. You built that foundation with him, Olivia. You know its donors, its shell companies, every crooked little deal he ever made. No one else knows it like you do." Her words struck me like a match to dry tinder. Andrew had stripped me of my home, my friends, even my children, but he'd made one mistake. He assumed that because I'd been silent, I'd been blind. I sat up slowly, my pulse pounding. Even if I expose him, who would listen? They've already chosen their villain. Sophia's expression softened, a sly smile creeping across her face. "Then don't go after his reputation," she said. "Go after his money. Quietly. You don't need the world to believe you yet. You just need to make him bleed." Her plan was dangerous, but it lit something inside me I thought had been extinguished forever. That night, after she left, I sat at the kitchen table surrounded by old foundation ledgers, tax filings, and donor contracts. The papers felt heavy in my hands, each line of numbers a clue, a weapon waiting to be sharpened. The city outside my window buzzed and roared, but inside my little apartment, there was only silence and the scratch of my pen. As the clock ticked past midnight, My grief crystallized into something harder, sharper. Resolve. Andrew thought he'd taken everything from me. But he'd left me with the one thing he should have feared most. Knowledge. Knowledge wasn't enough. Not yet. It was a blade, yes, but one I had to sharpen carefully, in the shadows, until the day came to strike. I spent the first few weeks studying quietly, mapping out every detail of Andrew's empire. The Carter Foundation wasn't just a charity. It was a maze of shell companies, offshore accounts, and fake non-profits designed to hide dirty money. Marcus Bell, the foundation's CFO and one of the last loyalists to my late father, had been keeping his distance since Andrew's public smear campaign. He hadn't taken sides, but he hadn't reached out either, not until I sent him a message late one night. It was short and to the point. Meet me. No one can know. We met in a dimly lit parking garage beneath an empty office building downtown. It felt like something out of a spy thriller, which, given the stakes, wasn't far from the truth. Marcus's face was pale as he approached my car. "Olivia," he said, glancing around nervously, "if Andrew finds out." "He won't," I interrupted, my voice calm, steady. "And you wouldn't be here if you didn't already know something's wrong." He swallowed hard. Then he slid a folder through my window. "These are internal transfer records from the past year. Offshore accounts, dummy vendors, fake invoices. It's worse than you think." I didn't thank him. I just nodded, clutching the folder like a lifeline. From that night forward, Marcus became my silent ally, carefully feeding me documents and insider details, always leaving just enough distance to keep suspicion away from himself. By day, I played the part of the disgraced ex-wife. I ran errands in faded jeans, kept my head down, and let the public think I was licking my wounds. But at night, my apartment transformed into a war room. Papers covered every surface. Flow charts, timelines, and bank account numbers formed a web on my living room wall. Sophia would sit across from me, a glass of wine in hand, watching as I pieced the puzzle together. "This isn't just fraud," she murmured one evening, tracing her finger over a highlighted line on a contract. "It's federal. SEC violations, tax evasion. This could bring down half his donor network." "Exactly," I said, the corner of my mouth lifting slightly. "If we go public now, Andrew spins it as my revenge. No one listens. But if regulators uncover it quietly, they'll destroy him from the inside out," Sophia finished, a gleam of admiration in her eyes. "We didn't just hand the evidence over all at once. That would have been too easy. Too obvious. Instead, we fed it piece by piece, to the IRS, the SEC, and even a few key compliance officers at the banks Andrew relied on. Each new packet of information sparked a new investigation, a new set of questions. Andrew never suspected me. Why would he? In his mind, I was ruined, powerless, irrelevant. I still remember the first time I saw the confusion flicker in his public smile. It was at a charity luncheon 6 weeks into our plan. I sat at a distant table, unacknowledged, while he stood on stage, beaming for the cameras. Mid-speech, his phone buzzed. His smile faltered, just for a second. It was a tiny crack, but enough to tell me our storm was gathering strength. As Andrew scrambled to patch holes in his empire, I began targeting his inner circle. One by one, I quietly courted board members and major donors. Coffee dates, casual lunches, carefully planted seeds of doubt. I didn't accuse Andrew directly. I simply asked questions that made them wonder. "Have you noticed how the numbers don't quite match up? Funny how certain projects get all the funding, isn't it?" By the time rumors began to swirl, I already had their trust. The final piece fell into place when Marcus uncovered a trail of transactions tied to a luxury condo in the Cayman Islands, a property Andrew had been hiding under another name. Sophia's eyes gleamed when she saw the paperwork. "This is it, Olivia. This is the kill shot." I smiled, slow and sharp. "Not yet. Let him think he's safe a little longer." From the outside, it looked like Andrew was still winning. The papers still praised his philanthropy, and his galas still drew crowds. But beneath the surface, the tide was shifting. Banks began freezing accounts without warning. Suppliers cut ties. Quiet investigations swirled in rooms Andrew couldn't see. He still thought I was broken, irrelevant. And that was exactly what made me dangerous. Narration hardened as I studied the tangled web of his lies, my resolve like steel. He thought I was powerless. But while he smiled for the cameras, I was pulling every string beneath the stage. From the very beginning, Andrew had been the king on the chessboard, the center of every move, every plan, every headline. But he never understood the game. Kings are visible, predictable, vulnerable. The real power lies with the pieces no one sees. And for 10 years, I'd been quietly learning how to move them. By the time the first federal inquiry began to nibble at Andrew's empire, he was too busy juggling appearances to notice the ground shifting beneath him. A frozen account here, a delayed wire transfer there. Small, manageable problems he dismissed as coincidence. But Marcus and I knew better. One late evening, I met Marcus in a quiet corner of a nearly empty coffee shop. The rain streaked down the windows, blurring the view of Detroit's financial district. "He's spread too thin," Marcus whispered, sliding a flash drive across the table. "These files cover the Cayman property and a series of shadow accounts. If the regulators get their hands on this, it's over." I wrapped my fingers around the drive, but didn't plug it in just yet. Timing was everything. "Not yet," I said, leaning back in my chair. "If we move too soon, he'll just spin it, claim sabotage, rally his allies. No, we let him tighten the noose himself." Marcus gave me a look that was half admiration, half unease. "You've been planning this for a long time." I didn't deny it. I just sipped my coffee, calm and measured. Andrew built his power by deception. I'll take it apart the same way. While Andrew scrambled publicly, I moved quietly in spaces he'd never expect. The board members had always been his puppets, wealthy donors and legacy families dazzled by his charm. But charm fades when money vanishes. I began meeting them one by one, always casually, always in settings that felt safe and intimate. A lunch here, a quiet gallery tour there. I didn't accuse Andrew of anything directly. I simply asked questions and let silence do the rest. "Do you remember that children's hospital project from last year?" I'd ask softly, tilting my head. "Funny, isn't it, how the funding disappeared?" Their brows would furrow. Doubt would flicker. I never pressed. I simply let the seed take root. Martha Green, the COO, became an invaluable ally during this phase. She began circulating subtle reports through the board, tiny discrepancies, hints of financial mismanagement, carefully written so they raised eyebrows without pointing fingers. Each report was like a drop of water on stone, carving away Andrew's credibility bit by bit. Meanwhile, Sophia handled the legal side. "Regulators move slowly," she explained one night in my apartment, surrounded by stacks of files. "But once they have enough evidence, they won't just freeze his accounts, they'll dismantle his entire network." "Good," I said simply. Sophia studied me for a long moment. "Olivia, are you sure you don't want to go public? Tell your side now." I shook my head. "If I speak now, it becomes about me versus him. He thrives on spectacle. This way, the story isn't mine to tell, it's the truth, revealed piece by piece." Her lips curved into a slow smile. "You really are playing the long game." Andrew, meanwhile, was blissfully ignorant. At a charity mixer downtown, I watched from a shadowed corner as he laughed too loudly, Sabrina glittering at his side. "She's got incredible instincts," he bragged to a group of donors. "She's been giving me insider advice. You'll see big moves from us soon." I almost laughed. Sabrina didn't realize half the insider advice she passed along had been planted by me. He thought he was climbing higher. He didn't see the cliff edge inches from his feet. The first real crack came when a prominent donor abruptly withdrew funding for one of Andrew's pet projects. He stormed into a board meeting, red-faced and furious, demanding answers. I wasn't there physically, but through Marcus and Martha, my presence was felt. Every raised eyebrow, every whispered doubt, every small silence was my doing. They thought they were watching Andrew lose control, I reflected, my voice like ice. What they didn't know was that I'd been shifting the board all along, moving one piece at a time until checkmate was inevitable. Andrew had always been the loudest voice in every room. When he entered, conversation shifted, laughter swelled, and attention locked on him as if he were the sun. But suns burn out. And when they do, they collapse into themselves. I'd spent months setting the stage for his implosion. Now, all I had to do was let gravity take over. It started small, almost invisible, just like I wanted. Marcus came to my apartment one rainy evening, a plain envelope tucked under his arm. He locked the door behind him before he spoke. "The IRS has received the first set of documents," he said, lowering his voice. "They're opening an investigation. Quietly, for now." I exhaled slowly, nodding. "Good. We don't need noise. Just motion." He placed the envelope on my coffee table like it was a live explosive. "These next accounts are the ones tied to his real estate deals in the Caymans. Once these freeze, he won't be able to access cash." "Perfect," I said, my tone steady. "Cut off the money, and everything else falls apart." Marcus hesitated, studying me. "Olivia, once this starts, there's no going back." I met his gaze, unblinking. I burned my bridges the day he buried me alive. While regulators worked behind the scenes, I went to work on the foundation itself. Andrew's empire thrived on perception. As long as donors believed in him, the foundation stayed afloat. So I began eroding that belief. One by one, I met with key donors in quiet settings, private lunches, charity planning sessions, even unplanned run-ins at art galleries. I never accused Andrew directly. Instead, I asked soft, leading questions. "Did you notice the construction delay on the pediatric wing? Strange, isn't it, how the funds for that project disappeared? I'm sure it's just an oversight, but Andrew's been so busy lately." I left my words hanging like smoke. Donors filled the silence with their own doubts. The boardroom began to fracture. Whispers became questions. Questions became concerns. Concerns turned into calls to auditors. And all the while, Andrew had no idea I was the one who'd lit the match. The first public crack came at a licensing hearing in Lansing. Andrew had been preparing to launch a flashy new initiative, complete with press releases and investor pitches. On the morning of the hearing, I sat in my car across the street, watching as his attorney burst through the courthouse doors, pale and sweating. Inside, the Michigan Department of Licensing and Regulatory Affairs had just revoked Andrew's permits. No announcement. No warning. Just silence and a door slammed shut. When Andrew emerged minutes later, shouting into his phone, I smiled behind the wheel. Sabrina played her part beautifully, without even knowing it. She was eager to impress Andrew, desperate to prove her worth. So when he pushed her for insider information, she delivered everything he asked for. Exactly what I wanted him to hear. A new donor ready to back his venture. A government contact willing to expedite approvals. A tip about a property deal too good to miss. All lies. All planted by me. And Andrew, arrogant and blind, believed every word. The fallout hit like a storm. One week, he was in glossy magazines, photographed with Sabrina on red carpets. The next, his face was on the evening news under the headline, "Carter Foundation under federal investigation." Bank accounts froze. Properties seized. Partnerships dissolved. Andrew's smile began to crack in public. He snapped at reporters. Cancelled appearances. Sabrina clung to his arm, confused and frightened. Meanwhile, I watched it all from my quiet apartment, a cup of tea in hand, my reflection calm in the window. "He thought he was untouchable," I whispered to myself. "But when you rot something from the inside, It collapses under its own weight. And Andrew was collapsing beautifully. The night of the annual Carter Foundation board meeting, Detroit glittered like a city on display. The skyline shimmered in the distance, sharp and cold against the winter sky. 4 years, that meeting had been Andrew's throne room. A place where his charm dazzled, his power solidified. Tonight, he had no idea it would become his execution chamber. I arrived early, slipping into the building through a side entrance I'd once used countless times as the smiling, supportive wife. Now, no one looked twice at me. To them, I was a ghost, an exile who'd been erased from this world. Perfect. The boardroom itself gleamed with sterile luxury. Polished mahogany table, walls lined with framed photos of charity galas and smiling children, the glossy facade Andrew had built to hide the rot beneath. Marcus was already there, seated near the far end. He gave me a subtle nod, his face unreadable. We had rehearsed every step of what was about to happen. "Everything's ready?" I asked quietly. He slid a slim folder toward me. "When you open this, it's over." I didn't touch it yet. Timing mattered. Andrew swept into the room minutes later, Sabrina on his arm. He looked confident, even smug, despite the recent press coverage of federal investigations and missing funds. His suit was flawless, his smile wide, as though he could charm reality into bending to his will. "Evening, everyone," he said, his voice warm and commanding. "Let's get this handled so we can move on to building a brighter future." The board members chuckled, relieved by his bravado. He still had them wrapped around his finger, or so he thought. The meeting began with the usual formalities. Andrew dominated the conversation, boasting about new initiatives and promising lucrative partnerships. But as he spoke, a subtle shift began. One by one, board members started asking pointed questions. What about the frozen accounts in Grand Cayman? Why did our largest hospital project suddenly lose funding? Why did the state revoke our permits without warning? Andrew laughed it off at first. "Competitors spreading rumors," he said smoothly. "Regulators overstepping. Nothing we can't handle." But the laughter didn't come as easily this time. Doubt lingered in the air. I stayed silent, watching from the far end of the table like a shadow. Then, Marcus cleared his throat and opened his folder. "Actually, there's something the board should see." He passed around copies of documents, carefully curated evidence I'd spent months assembling. Wire transfers to offshore accounts. Fake invoices tied to shell companies. Personal expenses hidden under charitable fronts. As the pages moved down the table, the room grew quieter and colder. Andrew's smile faltered. "This is absurd," he barked, slamming a hand on the table. "These are fabrications." Marcus remained calm. "The regulators don't seem to think so. In fact, they've already confirmed most of this. Which brings us to tonight's vote." Andrew blinked, stunned. "Vote? What vote?" Martha Green, ever poised, spoke up. "A vote of no confidence. Effective immediately, the board has the power to remove the CEO and appoint a new one." The words hit Andrew like a physical blow. He turned to Sabrina, but she looked just as shocked as he did. One by one, hands went up around the table. Every single vote was against him. I waited until the silence was absolute before standing. For the first time in a decade, all eyes turned to me. "Hello, Andrew," I said softly, my voice carrying through the room. "You didn't think you'd see me here tonight, did you?" He stared, speechless, realization dawning far too late. I stepped closer, my heels sharp against the marble floor. "You built this foundation on lies and theft. And you used me as your shield. But while you were playing king, I was learning how to move every piece on this board." Gasps rippled around the table. Sabrina covered her mouth, horror in her eyes. Andrew could only whisper, "You." I smiled coldly. "Me." When the meeting adjourned, Andrew was no longer CEO. His access cards were deactivated before he even left the building. As he stumbled into the cold night, I remained behind, standing at the head of the table. For the first time, I wasn't the silent face of the foundation. I was its leader. The room didn't just see me tonight, I reflected, watching the city lights flicker through the glass walls. They saw the truth. And Andrew finally saw the cliff he'd been walking toward all along. Andrew didn't go quietly. For a few weeks after the board meeting, he clawed at every frayed thread of his empire like a drowning man refusing to sink. He tried to call in favors from old allies, but most wouldn't even return his calls. Those who did offered only polite excuses before hanging up. He went to the press, claiming a smear campaign. But his voice, once so commanding, now sounded desperate. The media began to turn on him, scenting blood in the water. And all the while, I stayed silent. I didn't need to speak. The systems I'd built were already in motion. From my corner office at Grant Motors headquarters, I watched the pieces fall. Sophia had arranged for a series of filings through regulators and federal agencies. One by one, Andrew's businesses were cut off at the knees. The IRS froze his personal accounts. The SEC launched a public investigation into his offshore holdings. The Michigan Department of Licensing revoked every permit tied to his side projects. When Marcus brought me the confirmation documents, he laid them on my desk with quiet reverence, like sacred texts. "It's done," he said softly. I ran a finger over the bold black stamps that marked the official notices. Frozen. Revoked. Under investigation. "Not quite," I replied. "We still need to remove Sabrina." Sabrina had always been more pawn than partner. She'd entered Andrew's life wide-eyed and eager, thinking she was stepping into power. In reality, she'd been part of my plan from the moment I learned who she was. Now, she had to be moved off the board completely. Martha arranged a promotion for her, one so tempting she couldn't refuse. A new title, a substantial raise, and a transfer to the Foundation's West Coast operations, thousands of miles from Detroit. When Sabrina accepted, she kissed Andrew goodbye with tears in her eyes, promising they'd figure it out. He didn't realize it was the last time he'd see her. Meanwhile, Andrew's world shrank by the day. Creditors came knocking. His luxury cars were repossessed one by one. The penthouse he once flaunted at parties now stood empty, stripped of art and furniture. I didn't revel in his suffering. I simply observed it, calm and detached, as if watching a storm dismantle a house I no longer lived in. The final blow came quietly, not with headlines or shouting matches, but with a simple envelope delivered to his temporary office. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a notice of foreclosure on his last remaining property. I'd arranged for it to arrive on the same day his last business license was officially revoked. That afternoon, Marcus and I sat in my office, looking out at the Detroit skyline as the sun dipped below the horizon. "It's over," Marcus said. "Yes," I agreed. For him. Later, Sophia joined me for a quiet toast. "You never once confronted him," she marveled, swirling her glass of wine. "I didn't need to," I said simply. "Andrew built his own trap. I just made sure he kept walking until he fell in." She raised her glass. "To victory." I raised mine, but my tone was softer, almost reflective. "To silence," I said. Somewhere across town, Andrew sat alone in an empty office with a stack of useless papers. No Sabrina. No allies. No future. I didn't have to strike him down. I only had to step aside and let him trip over his own arrogance. 10 years have passed since the night Andrew shattered my world. The Olivia who once stood in the shadows, silent and humiliated, no longer exists. Now I sit at the head of the Carter Foundation, a position I earned, not through titles or announcements, but through resilience, strategy, and patience. My corner office on the top floor overlooks the Detroit skyline. The city hums below, alive with the sound of progress and industry. The glass walls reflect not just my face, but the empire I rebuilt from the ashes of his lies. The foundation thrives now, its reputation restored and stronger than ever. Hospitals are being built. Real aid reaches communities. The work is real, not a cover for greed. Sometimes I walk through the headquarters unnoticed, blending into the hum of activity, listening to the laughter of employees who believe in what we do. That's when I feel it most, the quiet satisfaction of having turned his false kingdom into something true. My children are grown and thriving, free from the shadow of their father's mistakes. They know the truth now, not the twisted version Andrew once fed them. I have everything I need. And Andrew has nothing. It was at the Detroit Metropolitan Airport that I saw him last. I was returning from a meeting in Chicago, traveling alone, when I spotted him near a crowded gate. At first, I barely recognized him. The man who once commanded rooms now looked shrunken, hollow-eyed. His tailored suits replaced by something worn and ill-fitting. His hands trembled as he clutched a single suitcase, the sum of what was left. He saw me before I saw him. His face contorted, rage and desperation twisting together. "You," he hissed, his voice ragged. "You destroyed me." For a moment, I said nothing. I simply studied him, this shell of a man who had once called himself a king. Then I stepped closer, my heels clicking softly against the terminal floor. "No, Andrew," I said calmly, almost gently. "You destroyed yourself. I just refused to be erased." The words hung between us like smoke. He opened his mouth, searching for some last defense, but nothing came. I turned and walked away without looking back. As the automatic doors slid open and the crisp night air rushed in, I breathed deeply, feeling the weight of the past lift from my shoulders. He thought leaving me would make him powerful, I reflected, my voice steady. Instead, he walked straight into my world, and I let him drown in it. I didn't need to see his downfall to know it was complete. Because true power isn't about destroying someone loudly. It's about walking away, unshaken, while they crumble in silence behind you.